Well, welcome everybody. Yes, I'm Hazel Carter-Shell and I'm a business psychologist and board coach. Now, I work with technology firms and professional services, so I have a deep interest in today's topic. I am the chair of today's webcast. Now, if you're here, you're probably interested in financial decision making and to develop your understanding of how technology and human behaviour play a decision in decision making too. And if you're not, and you're in the wrong place, but you're intrigued enough to stay, you're still welcome. So what our aim is today is to explore if technology is advanced enough to allow us to make better decisions, and if so, how? Has it enabled us to make better choices that benefit our communities and allow us to capture data from these decisions in order to create worthwhile changes? But we want to understand decision making a little bit more. We're going to balance out that understanding of the technological side with an understanding of the human side and address some of the complex natures of human behaviour. Now, before we dive in though, I'm going to let the panel introduce themselves because they'll do a much better job than I will. So I'm going to start with Kat. Do you want to tell us a bit about yourself? Say hi.
Hi Hazel, thank you for this lovely introduction. So my name is Kat Werner. I'm a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University in the Department of Accounting, Finance and Banking. And I've done my PhD effectively on decision theory, where I was dwelling for over 5 years about how people make decisions when they faced with situations of risk, uncertainty, and ambiguity. So I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to shed a bit more light on this aspect of human decision making.
Fabulous. Looking forward to hearing more about it. Albert, introduce yourself, please.
So my name is Albert, surname Janse van Feren. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I have joined MMU as a senior lecturer roughly 18 months ago, predominantly teaching in management accounting and some fintech areas, but with my research interest really being how you estimate effort going into software development projects. And prior to joining MMU, I spent a good 2 decades in commerce, and roughly 8 years of those 2 decades spent designing financial software and automating business processes. So I'll be speaking about how we can use technology to aid decision making today.
Fabulous. Looking forward to that one. And John, round us off. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Thanks, Hazel, and it's good to be on a panel where, for once, my name is not the most unusual. So my name is John Toon. I work for Behaviour Struthers, a mid-sized firm based up in Manchester, and my role now is, well, it's a fancy title, Digital Strategy Lead, and my predominant focus at the moment is how do we make technology in our business and the people in our business and the data that we have in our business sync together so that we can make more informed, better decisions. And we also do that for our clients as well. So we're advising our clients on how to grapple with that data that they've got and their tech and their people, and help them to make decisions that are outside of just the kind of boring stuff that as accountants always focus on, which is just the numbers, and look at how there are other influences on a business.
Wonderful. Looks like we are in for a very interesting next hour, the conversations. Now, of course, I think it's always interesting to hear from the people who've joined us today. So we're going to do a quick poll just to understand a little bit about everyone's thinking of what stops us from making the right decisions. So I'm guess Emma's going to pop a poll up. So yeah, we're just given the usual quick options of multi-choice of what do you think before you've heard from the panel you think is the right decision? What stops us from making the right decision? And yeah, we've had an all of the above, or yeah, I don't know option, it's fine, unsure. And maybe by the end of this conversation, you might have a few more ideas. Of course, we've clearly all got our view. So hopefully we'll shortly be able to see what everyone thought. So definitely shows the complexity of the picture here. So predominantly people seeing the impact of not having the right data at the right time, certainly, and not having comprehensive data. As we all know, when you don't have the right data at the right time, in the right level of clarity. Also noting a few of you recognising the impact of culture, the impact of resources, and a fair significant chunk of you saying actually it's all of the above. It is a very, very complicated picture. Thank you for that. It's really helpful. So, as with all of these things, when we start off on a very complex picture, especially when there's human nature involved, I can't help it. I'm a psychologist. I'm going to have to, let's start by understanding the human bit of this particular dynamic. So Kat, can you kick us off on this one?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Hazel. Well, I'm just going to comment on the poll and how disappointed I was when I was about to click one of the options and it told me that I'm not allowed to vote as a panelist. So I know certainly what stops me from doing the right choices. But yes, thanks, Hazel. And what I wanted to say is that when we talked about this topic of technology and human behavior in decision making, it became evident that we have here two very powerful concepts: technology on one side and human behavior. And of course, because of my area of expertise, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the second part, which is the human part of how we making decisions. And I'm sure it's not going to surprise you if I start with something very basic, namely recalling the reasons for making decisions in the first place. I think it's really important to recall that we do face lots of decisions because we have to make them. And this need is effectively emphasized by this very well-known scarcity problem. So if any one of you have ever taken a basic economics or psychology class, you would know that we have loads of needs and probably even more wants. But of course, in this competitive world that we live in, the resources that we have available to meet these needs and wants are unfortunately scarce, they're limited. So we do need to choose. We need to choose really carefully if we want to maximize our utility, feel happy, and feel satisfied. And there would be nothing wrong about that, if not the fact that the whole decision-making process, as Hazel already highlighted really nicely, is extremely complex and is subjected to many different obstacles. Some of these obstacles are down to our internal human factors, but there are plenty of external obstacles that we as human beings face in our decision-making processes. So I just thought I'm going to focus a little bit more on three aspects, and I'm going to elaborate on them in a little bit more detail. So the first aspect is that we are forced to make many decisions. And I would ask Emma very kindly to share the slides to sort of visualize this situation a little bit more. So on a daily basis, we have to make loads and loads of decisions. And in fact, an average individual faces a number that is absolutely huge in terms of decision making that is being involved in our daily lives. It's 35,000 decisions that an average individual makes per day. And of course, this problem significantly amplifies when we're talking about organizations, where managers, leaders, CEOs, stakeholders, shareholders have to take into account all these different interactions and the additional factors that may be considered by others. So obviously, this problem will affect the way we are making decisions, or rather the outcome of our decision-making process. The second, probably unhelpful aspect is the fact that there is an expectation of us to make really good decisions. And more importantly, quite frequently, we expect of ourselves to make decisions that will be particularly good. So this adds the pressure to our decision making, which inevitably affects the whole process and consequently leads to potentially different outcomes to what we would achieve if we were making decisions free of stress, pressure, and some sort of aspirations that we're trying to meet. And finally, in this whole process, we are distracted by many, many different factors that are down to us, that are inherently human, but are also depending on the environment in which this decision-making process is taking place. One of this is, of course, the fact that quite frequently when making decisions, we don't even know the number, the alternatives that we are choosing between. So this lack of information, and at the same time, the desire to make the best information possible implies that we need to engage quite frequently in search for the information needed, which then has the implication that this process is costly and requires our effort. So individuals quite frequently are forced to carefully balance between the additional benefit that one can achieve through search and having extra information that would inform our decision-making process versus the actual outcome that can be achieved with this extra information. So that means that quite frequently we will not be able to reach this high level of aspirations that we imposed on ourselves early on, but rather we will be just happy with a satisfactory outcome. And of course, we can see the second side of the coin, which is the fact that frequently we have too much information. And I cannot emphasize enough how much this is the case in the 21st century. We have the access to the technology, to media, and to the information coming from very different channels, going well beyond radio and television, something that probably I'm used to from the 90s. So apart from these overload of choice or shortage of information, we are simple human beings, which means that our cognitive abilities are somehow limited, and we have narrow knowledge in specific fields, areas, and subjects. We are also exposed constantly to emotional influences. It doesn't have to be anger or stress. It can be simply feeling hungry or thirsty that may affect the decision-making process and ultimately the outcome. It's inevitably the time constraints that we constantly dealing and facing, whether it's in the context of making professional financial decision or making everyday life choices. It's the limited attention, limited memory, and finally, some things that are very characteristics of human behavior: limited willpower, bounded self-interest, and also limited self-control. So I'm just going to wrap it up very briefly by saying that there are plenty of factors, internal and external, that are affecting this process of decision-making that humans undertake on a daily basis. And as a result of this, we are frequently making decisions that are far from the optimal ones. They frequently are inferior or even adverse to our health, to our financial outcomes, and to our targets. So the question I think that my colleagues today will help me to answer, or at least elaborate on, is how technology can help us improve this decision-making potentially by overcoming some of these external and internal factors that I've just listed. But just to finish, I think it would be good to leave some room for the discussion of whether technology can actually add to the list of obstacles that we are facing on the way of decision-making. So I think that's it for me at the moment, and I'm very much looking forward to what Albert and John have to say.
Yeah,
Thanks,
well,
Hazel.
definitely. In the face of that level of complexity, as you say, and often suboptimal decision making, I think it's important. Let's hear what Albert's got to say from your perspective. Pick up the story from there. And this sounds like humans not doing the best job. So, how does technology help us here?
Yeah, Kat, it's actually amazing. A lot of the points that you've made is actually picked up in my slides as well. It almost looks like we collaborated prior to this, but I can promise that we haven't. I think great minds think alike. So when we talk about how technology enables decision making, I think we first have to chat about the process. In terms of getting there, in terms of how to use technology in that decision-making process. We can very easily jump into the theoretical benefits, but I wanted to highlight the process of decision-making using technology to show all the various different moving parts that's involved in this specific process. And the first one is that data. Now, for you to make any decision using technology, it has to be based off of data. Similar to the human decision-making process, you have to have a basis which you're informing that decision or which you're forming that decision off of. Now, in 2018, it was reported that on a daily basis, the world was producing a staggering 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every single day. Now, my mind is not maybe say sharp enough to even understand how big that really is. So I had to do some calculations, and that comes to about 2.2 million terabytes of data each and every single day. And this data is given to us or generated in two forms, namely structured and unstructured data. And the structured data, which comprises only 23%, roughly 520,000 terabytes of data every day, is the data that's theoretically easier to manage and to extract value from. And that's the stuff that comes in rows and columns, and you can very easily extract a relationship diagram based on that data. And in an organizational context, you should, in theory, be able to extract a lot more value based on that data, purely because it's easier to manage. But the other 77% of data that's being generated is unstructured data. So it's audio, it's photos, it's GPS information, it's weather information. And if you overlay these two with each other, it creates a very, very murky set of waters. So if you think about those two types of data, as an organization, this data needs to be stored. So an organization needs to decide whether or not this data is going to be stored on premises or in the cloud, each coming with its own complexities and risks. But even more importantly, in terms of where you're going to store it, is the how you're going to store it, which raises the question of data governance, data quality, data security, data management. And without that being in place, you can't get to that place where you want to start processing data. So if you've got your structured and your unstructured data in a decent storage facility, and you've got your governance and your quality checks in place, you can now start processing and extracting value out of or from your data. But in order to do that, you need complementary technology, because it's very easy to get raw data out of any database. But for you to start making informed decisions, to get insights into your business, for automated decision making to happen, you are going to have to pair that, let's call it big data, with complementary technologies such as data visualization tools or artificial intelligence or machine learning tools. And it's only once you've followed this entire process that you can get to a place where you can make decisions. And I wanted to highlight this process because it just shows all that specific moving parts in this, call it value chain, that leads to people being able to make decisions with the help of technology. Now, if you can get that right, there's some real benefits to organizations and to individuals. So for the first time, we can really define our customer behaviors because we are able to segment our customers not based on thoughts or perceptions, but on actual data, which leads to risk identification, quantification, and then greater business insight. So we can really understand our business, we really understand our clients, which then allows us to plan better for the future, whether that is in forecasting, production, product launches, product development. It's all based on actual data and insights that's been generated and analyzed. And that then allows us to make more accurate decisions, and in theory, on an activity-based model, a cheaper decision, and allows organizations to start making automated decisions in the less risky or the more mundane type scenarios. If we look at what industry has been doing over the last couple of years, the chart on your left shows investment into artificial intelligence. And you can see that from 2019 to 2021, investment in artificial intelligence has almost doubled. And if you look at investment into big data analytics, you can see that by 2025, we almost have a 500% increase on 2019 levels. And it's interesting to see how the various different industries are wanting to incorporate this artificial intelligence and big data processes into their everyday operations. Now, this chart in itself is a little bit too busy, so I've split it to show what each and every single, what these four industries are doing with artificial intelligence adoption in the various areas of their business. If we look at the business, legal, and the professional services industry, you can see that that's largely tracking with industry norms, and no real outlier, maybe for risk management, where artificial intelligence is being incorporated. But if we look at the financial services industry, you can see that those benefits of risk management and risk quantification is really being, or efforts are going into trying to exploit those benefits, understanding that by analyzing your data and knowing your customers, knowing your segments, that you are able to build risk quantification models that should lead to a better understanding of your clients and hopefully better profitability. But also in the services industry, and even a little bit in marketing and sales. And maybe that's the biggest characteristic or the biggest embodiment of that specific fact is maybe the closure of high street banks, and where you've got more a artificial intelligence type service offering. Now, completely on the opposite end of the spectrum, you see the healthcare industry almost lacking behind in every single area in terms of artificial intelligence and adoption. Now, my assumption here, and this is purely just a assumption, it's not a researched fact, but it's almost as if the human race still needs to be or wants to be cared for by humans and not necessarily artificial intelligence. And you can see that in that risk management and that service operations areas where AI adoption is really lacking behind all industry trends. And then lastly, as expected, you see the technology or the telecom industries leading the way against industry averages. So one almost have, it brings us to this point where you have to ask, can human behavior then be influenced? If we know that human behavior produces the massive amounts of data, and if we analyze and store them correctly, we can know, or we will know, more about people than what we've ever done before on a very factual basis. And then you have to ask yourself, can this behavior be influenced to create mutual benefit shareholder wealth, but also impacting the lives of customers and communities in a meaningful way. And I'm not going to go into each and every example, but here's just a couple of institutions that believe that by using that data, by using analytics, and incorporating that into their decision-making process, that they are able to plan for disasters, to impact mobility or mortality rates, creating safer drivers, or even in the case of the NHS, creating a healthier society, which, I mean, apart from the fact that people will be living longer, will be generating tax revenues for a longer period of time. So I just want to make a couple of closing remarks before handing over to John. But using data or big data and artificial intelligence in the decision-making process leads to undoubtable gains. It's been well proven, but we are still only in the infancy stages. And companies are only starting to unlock some of those big data and AI and analytic benefits when it comes to that decision-making processes. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it requires a substantial amount of investment. Even though on an activity-based method, the decisions become cheaper, you still need a huge chunk of investment to get that value chain operating optimally before you can start using that in any decision-making process. And that is always going to require a relatively large chunk of investment. And then lastly, I think we still have a very long way to go in terms of the ethics of incorporating technology in everyday decision-making, in those big decision-makings. And that's probably why that healthcare industry is lacking behind, because of the ethical nature of that specific industry. And then one has to always ask the question, how sustainable is this in terms of data storage? If you think about energy consumption of data centers, you know, is that something that is having a positive impact on society at large? So I'll stop with at that point, hand over to John to hear some of his insights.
Maybe have a different perspective.
There's always a different perspective. I mean, the great advantage for me is that I'm not an academic, so I can tell you how it really is out in the real world. And so, I mean, as I said before in my intro, you know, my expertise, my specialism is dealing with SMEs and owner-managed businesses in particular. And I think quite often we don't often think about the human or the sort of, you know, the high-tech solutions when it comes to decision making, and as much as businesses would like to, you know, blend those two together, as I said in my intro, one of the biggest challenges is how to get the technology, the data, and people in sync. And quite often what we find in businesses, you know, and these, you know, bearing in mind these are businesses that aren't able to invest significant sums of money to even really remotely consider things like AI and machine learning as a solution to maybe assisting with the decision-making process, is that quite often they find that they've got data in disparate systems, and so they've effectively got silos of information, different operational structures, different operational information, but it all feeds into the central hub of the wheel of the business. And in terms of being able to make decisions and keep that wheel turning as effectively as possible, you need all of those systems to talk to each other. And the biggest challenge is often those are often incompatible. So what we will find is we will have, you know, maybe a business that's got, say, a CRM system that's on the cloud, and they've got great data in there, they've got really good access to it in terms of APIs and things like that. But then they maybe have a finance system that's an old, you know, on-prem solution, doesn't talk to anything else, can't pull that CRM data in. And so you've immediately got really fundamental problems in terms of, you know, you might have a customer name in your CRM that doesn't even match to the customer name in your account system. And so when you think about how you want to start making decisions, you've got some quite big issues to overcome there. And I mean, the way that I kind of think about it is that, if you're a bit of a movie buff, which I am, the latest Top Gear movie is out at the moment, and give it, 4 weeks, and it'll be on a streaming service somewhere. And probably, quite a few people on the panel and who are listening in will have more than one streaming service that you're subscribed to. Although I do appreciate the cost of living crisis might be taking a pinch there. You might be chopping that down, but if you want to see the latest, Top Gear movie, Top Gun movie in a few weeks' time, the way to find out which streaming service it'll be on is you'll just Google it. It'll be dead simple. You'll go on Google and you'll do it. Now, SMEs don't have a Google for their finance and systems data that they have within there, and so that's a fundamental problem that we have to try and overcome. And we overcome that in lots of ways. So we may well move more systems into the cloud so that we can use those APIs to talk to each other and connect those data points together, or we might go down something more sophisticated, like a data lake, for example, and start pulling data from various places. As soon as you do that, what that means is we're getting rid of inconsistency, because what we also tend to find is that decision making within smaller businesses in particular tends to be made using data that's not been tested for its reliability. And also what we tend to find is the focus for SMEs is around financial data, and that's probably driven by people like me, because I'm an accountant, and so we kind of like financial data. It's, we like profit and loss and cash flow and all those kind of things, and people focus on that because it's felt like that's the right thing to do in terms of driving driving a business forward. The other issue is that we tend to also typically look at what is historic data. So we're looking at what was last month's performance like. So what are we going to make decisions for this month on? How are we predicting what that trail of events looks like? And given that we've just come through 2 years of crazy madness with COVID and Brexit and everything else, the last 2 years are no indication of what the future looks like for many businesses. And so that adds another layer of unreliability within the data. As I mentioned, the other key thing is that the non-financial data, which is actually probably some of the key metrics for a business in terms of its success, tend to be tied up in other operational systems. And the challenge for many businesses is, how do you take that non-financial data out of systems and then look at how that affects the other decision-making processes that you make and the other financial impacts of those, so that you can then make more informed decisions. So let me give you a few examples, right? So we're an accountancy business. All of our staff complete timesheets, and most of them hate them. I hate them, but they're required. Yeah, we need to understand what our input into the business is in terms of our time. What jobs we're working on, whether we're working on a client job or an internal job, which might not generate us any money. And what we tend to find is that most of our staff miraculously work 37.5 hours a week, every week, consistently, week on week, even though we know for sure they're allowed holidays, for example, but also we know for sure that in the busy periods they're working more overtime, putting extra hours in to get jobs done, to get things completed and everything else. And yet we're sitting here making decisions based on that timesheet data, saying, well, we don't have a resource problem because everyone's working bang on the hours they should be doing. There's no overtime work, so it's not a problem. The reality is that we know there's fundamentally a problem there in terms of our resource requirement. We also know that there are peaks and troughs in our business, which mean that our staff have to flex. But our data does not represent the reality of what's going on in the business. And so we're currently going through a process at the moment where we're going to start tracking more and more of the time that people do, and that's going to drive the inputs into their timesheets so that that data becomes more fundamentally reliable from a point in time. It will also show us where our staff maybe, let's say, have previously massaged the data a little bit in terms of, they might have put a bit too much time into a job, which they didn't think was appropriate, but not recorded that. It will give us some more insights around that. Equally, what we're pretty certain of is it will show that our staff work bloody hard, but they don't necessarily record it because they don't feel obliged to do so in the right way. And that's both a system issue, it's a data issue, but it's also a people issue as well, because our people don't feel that they can record the right amount of time in the system. So it kind of comes back to Kat's point about, there's an impact everywhere. Another example is that if you're in the restaurant trade, The things that really drive the success of a restaurant business are things like the number of covers. So how many bums on seats can you get in a restaurant? How quickly can you turn them around in an evening, kick them out and get someone else in so that you can get some more money? Other things like bookings, the spend per head, your margins on your wet and dry stock, expiry dates, that's fundamentally really important. None of that's really financial, but it's really critical to the success of your business. And some of that is future looking as well. So if I've got 100 bookings for next week, that's great, because then I know how many staff I need to have on the rotas. I need to know how much food I'm going to have in. I've got a reasonable expectation of how successful that week will be, assuming that people spend a reasonable amount per head. And then going back to Albert's point about where big data can be useful for businesses. So I've been working with a children's nursery group here in the Northwest. They've got high growth expectations, but the structure and financial success of a particular setting for a nursery is affected quite fundamentally by the relative deprivation of an area. So if you open a nursery in a particularly deprived area, the likelihood is that the parents of that child or those children will make use of the free hours that the government provide for those children, which is between 3 and 5 years. That's only on a part-time basis. And so what you tend to find in a more deprived areas that you have more children on the roll, but attending nursery on a part-time basis. Whereas if you go to an affluent area, mum and dad are probably both working, probably earning reasonably well, and can afford to put their child or children in the nursery full-time, 5 days a week, and pay for that, and possibly at a time where it's maybe like 8 till 6 because it covers the commute and everything else. And so you'll have less children on the roll in a more affluent area. You'll probably have more demand because the spaces are up for grabs and there's less flexibility in the rota system. But also what you'll tend to find is that wage demand in those areas might be higher for the staff that come in and things like that. And so we've been working with one of our nursery groups to look at their existing structure. We've been using deprivation data that's come in from the UK government, and then mapping that across their existing settings, and then looking at their target areas and how they then make more informed decisions. We also took the opportunity, because we looked at all of their management information that they were using, and it was pretty horrendous. Basically, they had lots and lots of financial information driven from over 90 nurseries at the time, and it was just too unmanageable. It was too much information, too much going on, too much noise. You couldn't see through what was really important to driving the business and focusing in on a number of key KPIs. So that for me is like the fundamental, is that as I said, SMEs in particular tend to have trouble with their data and their systems to make it more useful for them to make decisions. And there are layers of unreliability in there. And I don't think we're even sort of scratching the surface in terms of having the opportunity to use technology like AI that Albert mentioned, or even to fundamentally go back and consider the people that Kat had mentioned, and how decision making affects them and affects maybe their employees or their shareholders or the success of the business.
That certainly poses quite a lot to think about there, John. I'm intrigued at the connection that's starting to emerge, because and we'll be throwing out questions to our listeners at the moment on the webcast, because what does seem to emerge is this connection to ethics. John, you've raised the challenge of when data's used, then yes, you can optimize profits, but at a cost. And there's some ethical choices sometimes to be made. I know certainly the move towards things like ethical capitalism, that sometimes there is a balance, that it doesn't always have to be this binary choice. And I know we've positioned it a little today as this binary choice between people and technology, and maybe the more interesting way forward is, well, how both? In what way does it become affordable to businesses? In what way can businesses not lose sight of the people at the heart? I'm noticing we've had a couple of questions already, so while our audience think about what that's the questions that fabulous panelists have simulated. Very early on, we were asked by someone, how in control do you think we really are of our own actions? And is it possible to determine this? Well, I'm going to have to throw this one to a cat, I'm afraid.
That's perfectly fine, Hazel. It's a very good question, but I'm afraid that the answer may be relatively grim, because I think we are not much of a control of our own actions, because it depends actually also on the type of actions that we are looking at. We know perfectly well from psychology, from observations and experiments, that people tend to deal with different types of decision making, and when decisions are more important to us, that there is more at stake, we somehow feel that we are more in control of making this action. We somehow manage to find more time to analyze the problem, to collect more information, simply because it's more important for us to get the decision right.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, most of the things that we'll be doing on a daily basis are done automatically, which means that we don't really even think about doing them. It's like my colleague usually says, it's like with driving or riding a bike. Once you've learned that, you've done it a few times, you never think about how to do it again. I'm in this unfortunate situation where I'm taking the driving lessons, but that's beyond the point at the moment. So, can we determine that? I think the point is, I think we can get better at doing so by simply trying to pay more attention to things we are doing. But as we said, this process will be very costly, will cause us headaches, will take time away from other things that we wanted to do. So if somebody wants to track their decision-making process, there will be a lot of sacrifice involved in terms of losing the time spent on the things that were automatic, and taking it to actually analyze whether these automatic decisions have been done correctly, and not even mentioning, of course, about the decisions that are more complex. I hope this helps.
Oh, absolutely. I was very taken, Albert, by your commentary, the differences in AI take-up with healthcare. I spend a chunk of my working day creating behavioural influencing strategies for healthcare to influence population health. And so that I definitely would say that gives some answer to that, how in control of our behaviours are we, because I don't think many people are aware of how many influences are shaping their behaviours every single day. And now I suppose the big question then comes back is that are the ethical considerations being discussed by the organisations making those shaping decisions or using those technologies and those research elements? Because I think sometimes I get involved in conversations and think, I haven't thought of the ethics at all. It's simply, you want to shift that behaviour and you're going to try. So yeah, interesting. Albert, you got a build on that?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a big chunk of my commercial career working in organizations that that believed we could influence behavior in a seemingly noble way, but that would have an influence on, or a positive influence on profit at the end of the day. But the reality of the matter is that even if you design something which you think is noble, or a profit motive, I think sometimes you forget about the person that you're designing this for. Now, if you use the example of, let's say, the NHS wanting to create a healthier society because the burden on the NHS that arises with obesity, is maybe not as sustainable in the future. It's very easy to start, let's say, developing, which the NHS has, an app that helps you control or better your eating habits. So it's a very noble purpose, but forgetting the person and the mental or the cognitive load that you put on people can actually create a bit of a burnout situation for that person. So even though it's a seemingly ethical decision, it's a very noble ambition to get people healthier, the process of getting them there is maybe not as beneficial to them as you think, and you might do some harm in that process. And that's kind of what I mentioned with, we have some way to go in terms of the ethics, because we can not only consider the outcome, we need to think about the process, but the people on that journey is or should not be neglected.
And I know there's a question specifically asked about so saying you have a long way to go in ethics and sustainability, but a question was asked of you that what does the financial service sector need to collectively do to address that?
It's an interesting question. I think if you think about the financial services industry and you think about the pure profit motives, I mean, the easiest answer is always self-regulation, but they would have to come together and create some non-negotiables to collectively agree on putting the human first, and then tag profitability to that at the end. Now, that is a very noble wish, I suppose, and it's something that's maybe easier said than done. But in my view, that's the direction that we have to go. Even though we're making use of technology and we're automating decisions, or we supplementing decisions with technology, I don't think we must lose sight of the individual that we're making them for.
No, that's yeah, really powerful. Love that idea. I just think it's interesting, some of the responses coming out of AI research from the military. You think throw a lot of money at this stuff, and there's still a recognition that there's some types of decision making that cannot be replaced by AI, and that's using moral judgments because it's something particularly human. So it's nice to know we'll still have a role at some point. I've also been asked, there's a question, do the panel think there's been a shift in attitudes towards AI and tech, and a move away from being fearful of it, becoming more open to what it can help us achieve? I'm going to ask each of you your view on that, but John, I'm going to start with you first.
Yeah, so I mean, I think just picking up just very quickly on the point about sort of ethics and sustainability, I think we know that those businesses that really embrace ESG have a good, strong sort of moral backbone, if you like, in terms of their business operations and how they deal with environmental issues, tend to be much more successful than those that are not. The biggest challenge for businesses, particularly again SMEs, is quite challenging not to just simply pay lip service to that and actually be able to measure your impact. Usually you can just about do it as a business on your own, but once you start to flood down the supply chain and up to your customer base as well, it can be incredibly challenging. But in terms of embracing AI and wider pieces of technology, I think COVID has sort of fundamentally changed that. I think in the past we kind of had this fear that the robots were coming for us and that it was all over sort of thing. And I think the reality of the situation now is that a lot of businesses are much more accepting that technology plays a role in their business. Whether that's in a manufacturing process, whether it's in a financial process, whatever it might look like, and that there's an efficiency gain to be made from doing that, not just a decision-making gain, and that of course potentially leads to better profits, better cash flow, etc. So I do think that's kind of the way it goes. I think what's most challenging for smaller medium-sized entities now, though, is that there's so much technology out there, and so actually. The decision-making process is hard around how do I find the best piece of technology to enable me to move forward.
Thanks. Kat, Albert, any other views on that one? Are you seeing any shifts in attitude? Kat first. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to link to what John just said and what Albert said earlier. I think we're going back again to this direction of sustainability and ethics around it, because while I totally agree with John, and I think we see now technology as something inevitable, but we don't fear it anymore as we used to before. We consider it basically part of our everyday life, and this is not just in the context of financial sector, but really everyday life with phones, with media, with loads of information that is facilitating our decision making on a daily basis. But I think what we quite frequently don't see is how technology affects us without being aware of it. So we can see this profit motive that Albert mentioned, that many commercial companies are using. And there is a absolutely brilliant TED talk by Eddie Pariser who highlights the so-called filter bubble, which shows how companies, based on, for instance, our search on internet, on phone or Google, are immediately tailoring all the information that we are receiving to what they think, what the algorithm said we are interested in, and consequently, basically providing us with the very narrow picture of what they think we want to see, based on previous searches, based on a history, based on the concepts that we were Googling or looking at. And I think everybody can see that if you're looking once for holiday, immediately when you're looking for it next time, you get the previous results back or something very similar. So I think we need to somehow make people more aware of both advantages and the potential disadvantages or threats associated with how AI and tech in general affect our decision-making processes.
Absolutely. I do find it fascinating that we are choosing a holiday based on the views and tastes of someone we've never met. And yet it does shape, I think, yes, Mrs. Smith from Blackpool, I do care what you thought of the coffee in that place. I'm actually conscious we've been asked a couple more questions. So one of the questions was, do we over-rely on data that's easy to measure? Any thoughts on that from anyone?
I think there's probably a tendency to over-rely on data, and maybe sometimes discard what is I suppose common sense, because John made a very, very pertinent point earlier on, saying a lot of that data is backward looking, and we used to say, history always repeats itself, but I mean, if you think of the last 3 years, you have to go back quite a while for all of these world events to happen at the same time. So I think in short, yes, there's a over-reliance on data, but I'm in that camp that just want more data, and maybe that sometimes leads to a bit of analysis paralysis, but yeah, I can honestly say that I'm in that camp that has a massive over-reliance on data, and it probably won't go away soon.
I was going to say the whole, so how do we mitigate that? It's like, we just want more. But I'm also intrigued, we've been asked, in a time of constrained business budgets, how should businesses prioritize investment in technology, and which technologies? And maybe, John, this is a question for you.
Thanks. I mean, that is the $1 million question.
It isn't it? I mean, answer that one and then retire.
Absolutely. I think for a lot of businesses, I mean, we talked about it before, but I think what we're seeing generally in technology, particularly again for SMEs, which my area, is that we're finding that there's a general transition to the cloud. Most of us are used to being mobile first. I think Kat said, we have everything in our lives is in our phones nowadays, and basically if you can't connect something to your phone, it's kind of dead to you, isn't it? So that is a general transition that we're seeing. In terms of where to prioritize, I mean, that's a really challenging thing to answer, because I mean, we see everything from businesses that are using 20-year-old systems that are no longer supported, and they've got an old lady or an old man who used to do the programming in a care home, providing support, to people that are fully embedded, you've really embraced technology, and they're looking for absolutely the next cutting edge thing to try and squeeze just a little bit more out of what they've already got. So it is challenging. What I would say is that for me, maybe because I'm an accountant, I would always say that finance is the hub of the business, in terms of what everything feeds into finance, and so all of your other operational systems will feed into that. And so I would focus on that first, and then build the spokes of that wheel out from there. Having said that, I'm pretty certain if there was somebody from a HR business or a manufacturing, with that manufacturing expertise, they would say something different. But
I'd be shouting by now.
Absolutely. But I think the other thing is that for me, technology is never about replacing people. Technology is always about enabling people to do more. And it's what we see, what we try and achieve when we're talking to our clients or talking internally about technology is how do we remove the mundane, the things that the robots can do really easily, the repetitively, which doesn't really need any thinking time, and how do we then utilize that time in a better way for our team or for our clients' teams to do more engaging, more interesting things.
Fabulous, thank you very
much.
much.
I could add to that.
Yeah, of course.
So the research shows that people or companies want to make investments into software using ROIs and payback periods and net present value calculations. But it's extremely difficult to quantify the benefits of moving to the cloud or the benefits of implementing process automation in those mundane tasks to free up strategic thinking. So that prioritization process becomes quite a difficult one to quantify, because how much would an hour's strategic thinking really be worth versus doing a mundane task?
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, Albert, because we don't do ROI. We used to try and do it for clients. We just don't. It's just not worth even trying to figure out what that might be worth.
What I find it fascinating in this debate is that, as you say, what's often starts as a conversation about technology and ROI. What's intriguing are the people on this call, our listeners at the moment. It's actually where we started, which is back with the humanity and some of the challenges. We're noticing we've been asked questions of, are we moving away from our human senses and choices? There's been a particular question for Kat, and maybe you can answer this one, whether it's part of human nature to want to feel in control of decision-making processes. And if so, this could be your $1 million question. If so, why do we want to be in control so much? And this may be something, if we've got in the 3 minutes we have left, we can attempt to answer. Because there's definitely something about people and control that's emerging in the questions that we've got coming up in the Q&A.
Well, I'll give it a shot, Hazel.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I think it's a fascinating question, and I must admit I haven't thought about it for a while. Because, well, it seems that it's our human nature, indeed, this attempt to be in control. And as you could see from the previous discussion, we actually consider the lack of self-control as our weakness. So I would say it's almost inherited that we want to be in control, because that enables us to be confident about decisions we make and helps us avoid the feeling of fear, uncertainty, and all these negative things that may actually be impacting us. So it's a normal thing of trying to get rid of the things that potentially may have negative impact on our decision making, that make us feel sad, make us feel simply down. So this is absolutely an excellent question, and I agree that we do simply want to be in control as human beings, and we can probably use technology to be more in control, because, like John and Albert mentioned, we have this larger data, we can see the bigger picture, but we cannot forget, while saying this and while we're analyzing this data, that in this whole process, we are losing quite frequently the control over what is being helpful to us, namely the technology itself. So I think it's a very thin line between being aware of all these things, and making sure that we're actually taking the best out of them, as opposed to letting ourselves be manipulated or affected by them.
Yeah. Thanks. But also, as we know, human beings don't like uncertainty so much. So that's the other benefit of being in control. Finally, I don't know if anyone's got a view. As we looks like we're coming to time, so we could get shut off any minute now. If we don't answer any of your questions, we will attempt to get answers out. But thank you so much to the panels. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. There will definitely be a bit of a wrap up and sending out of any information if you're interested. But it's been absolutely spectacular spending time with you. I think this one could run and run because there was so much richness coming out of that one. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.